It's all about the low end, y'all. It is always a good day when you get to mix the bass. Here's my tips and tricks for making the bottom end feel big and round. I don't think I can say that. Here's my tips and tricks for making the bass feel really good. And hey, if you're new here, go ahead and hit subscribe and ding the little bell. Mixing bass is tricky to do because you've got to contend with room acoustics, subs that may or may not be to your liking, and a diverse audience that might not want to hit the brown note. I mean, it would be really sad if you reset somebody's pacemaker. So a lot of times I'll start compressing the bass before I EQ it, just because I want it to be in one spot. Unless you've got a really, really talented bass player, their notes aren't going to be all even between when they go down low and up high. Remember, with our compression ratio, a lower number is going to give you less control but a bigger sound, and a higher number is going to get you more control but a smaller sound. I tend to compress my bass at about 3 or 4 to 1. I like to have a soft knee so that when they get quiet, it's still compressing and evening out those notes a little bit. As far as attack time goes, slow is amazing on the bass. If you have the attack too fast, it's going to thin out the bass and it's just not going to feel right. I set mine about 20 milliseconds. Now the release time depends on how quickly they're moving between notes, but I like somewhere in the 200 to 500 milliseconds range. So on this song, the bass player is playing some more sustained notes along with some faster notes in between, and I don't want to miss those, so I'm going to edge my release time on the faster side, around 250 milliseconds. I'm going to turn the release time a little bit slower and listen to how those notes don't come out quite as much. So the faster release time lets it come up a little bit more for those little grace notes, and I want to catch all those details. Don't be afraid to compress the bass a lot. The bass is usually only playing when the drums are in and loud, so it's really helpful to be able to park it in one place and adjust their dynamics on your own. I aim for about 5 to 10 dB of compression on my bass. Now again, because we've set our attack time slow, the more they push into the compression, the bigger it sounds. EQ on the bass can vary a lot between the source material, your audience's preferences, subs, and room acoustics. I mean, there's some congregations that just can't handle a whole lot of rumble, but there are a few tips to make your bass stand out without having to shake the rafters. Now, I'm always going to EQ my bass in the context of the other instruments so that I can make sure that the mid-range is matching the guitars and keyboards, and the bottom end is matching the punch and the sustain of the bass drum. A boost around 200 Hz can trick your ear into making the bass feel bigger than it is. This is especially helpful if your room is sub-challenged, or you just have people that don't want to feel it. Now stay to the end and I'll tell you why this works. Did you hear how the 200 Hz made it round out a little bit more and gave it a little bit more fullness? I didn't add any rumble, but I got a little more warmth out of it. The other frequency that I like to highlight with the bass is around 400 Hz. If you listen to Sting and the Police, his bass is really 400 heavy. And I don't recommend you go that far, but it kind of gives you an idea of what the 400 sounds like on a bass. Listen to how the notes get a little more defined as I add 400 or 500 Hz. It adds a lot more growl and note definition, which is really helpful on this song. If your bass player is sloppy and doesn't have his bass set up well, you can get a lot of clang from fret noise. This is one place where the low pass filter can really help. Just bring all that stuff down and you won't really miss it. Now let me turn on the high pass filter just to see what that feels like and see if it tightens up our bottom end any. The high-pass filter at about 40 Hz helps the subharmonics not to come through, make it flabby. But we're not really missing anything because 41 Hz is the lowest note on the 4-string bass. If your bass player has a 5-string bass, you might want to roll that down a little bit, but most of the time they're not playing below that low E. Now, a word about bass players playing through in-ear monitors. When a bass player is using in-ear monitors, that puts a driver really close to their ear, and it can give a lot of detail. The problem is they're hearing much more detail than you are about the top end of their bass. So less experienced bass players are going to tend to mix their tone a whole lot darker when they're using in-ears. I tend to find myself boosting a lot of mids to make up for that. The other problem with in-ear monitors is if they're not seated and sealed in your ear all the way, you're not going to hear the low end. It's a tiny little driver, and it has to have a sealed environment in order to produce those low frequencies. If your bass player's in-ears aren't sealed all the way, they're going to feel like their bass has no bottom end, and they're going to crank it up to compensate. This is another reason why boosting the mids can be really helpful. And don't forget to make sure that the rest of your team has in-ears that fit well too. It makes a world of difference. Now remember, the bass is the linchpin of your entire mix. It's connecting the drums to the rest of the rhythm section and forms a foundation for everything else to rest on. Remember, it's all about the low end. Get that right, everything else falls into place. And hey, if you like mixing bass as much as I do, type "it's all about the low end" in the comments below. When I'm mixing the relationship between the kick drum and the bass guitar, I'm looking for the kick drum to provide the punch and the bass guitar to provide the sustain. When one of those dominates the other, it doesn't quite feel right. But when they're locked in together, you can push up that low end and it just feels good. And also, a thick, full mix can be louder without feeling as loud. Try this next time you're sound checking. After you get your mix up and you get it nice and full, put an EQ on the master bus and roll up the high-pass filter. As you do, it will seem to get louder. As you roll that high-pass filter back down, the mids aren't going to feel quite as harsh, even though they're at the same level. Now, one pro secret for mixing bass is putting a high-pass filter on the side chain of the compressor. The side chain is the signal that the compressor looks at to compress. So when you adjust the EQ on the side chain of the compressor, you're not adjusting the EQ on the channel itself. The compressor isn't going to see those frequencies quite as loud. When the bass player goes really low, the compressor isn't going to squash those notes and it's going to get bigger and fuller. It can make a really great sound. Now, hear the difference between having the high-pass filter on the side chain of the compressor and not. I'm a big fan of that trick. You should try using it. Now, if you're privileged enough to be able to mix on an SSL console, the tube function on this compressor is really nice too. Take a listen. I love how it gives a little bit more to the overtones and grit without being over the top. I really like having that on every channel of this console. Earlier I told you about how boosting 200 Hz is going to help the bass feel bigger. Well, why is that? Well, we have to do a little bit of psychoacoustics to understand it. Your brain will add in fundamental frequencies that it's not hearing if it hears the overtone series of a note. If your brain hears the frequencies 200, 300, 400, and 500, it's gonna add in that missing fundamental and say, I bet 100's there. Next time you're mixing, roll the high-pass filter up on the acoustic guitar to 500 or so. Even though you're not hearing any of those fundamental frequencies, you can still tell what note is being played. So when you boost the EQ on the 200 Hz region of the bass, you're tricking your brain into thinking that those fundamental frequencies are louder than they are. When you think about old country music with the upright bass, that bass feels really big in the mix, but there's not a whole lot of 50 Hz going on there. How many country bass players does it take to change a light bulb? 1, 5, 1, 5, 1, 5. So if there's too much 50 Hz, it'll shake the needle off the record. And that's not very hipster. How many hipsters does it take to change a light bulb? It's a really obscure number. You probably never heard of it. Be sure to check out my other mixing tutorials. We'll see you back here next time. And now I leave you with the mix engineer's blessing. May your bottom end always be big and round.